For a long time, I thought my life could be divided into two versions of me. The one people saw, and the one I was always trying to understand in private. But as I got older, I realized the harder truth was that there had only ever been one person, one frightened, observant, deeply divided person trying to survive inside expectations that felt too narrow to breathe in. When I was little, I did not have the language for identity, and I definitely did not have the courage for honesty. What I had instead was attention. I noticed everything. I noticed the way women in my family seemed to be allowed a fuller emotional vocabulary than men. I noticed how my mother could be tired, sharp, kind, vulnerable, confident, and soft all in the same afternoon without anyone acting like she had failed at being herself. I noticed how the men around me seemed to grow more rigid as they aged, as if adulthood for them meant reducing themselves to function, duty, and silence. I noticed the small rituals that happened in bathrooms and bedrooms before anyone went out into the world. A hand smoothing a skirt, lipstick pressed carefully into the natural shape of a mouth, perfume dabbed behind an ear, a necklace clasped with concentration. As a child, I didn't think of any of that as glamorous. It felt private and serious to me, almost like armor, almost like prayer. I knew I was not supposed to stare, but I did, because something in those ordinary acts felt important. I had no idea then that I was watching people make themselves visible to the world, and that one day I would be desperate to learn how to do the same. My childhood was not dramatic in the way people sometimes expect these stories to be. There was no single terrible incident that explained me. No one could point to one event and say, that is why. My parents were imperfect, ordinary, hardworking people. My father believed in endurance more than conversation. He was not cruel for sport, but he respected only what he understood, and there were huge parts of human life he had never tried to understand at all. My mother carried more emotional intelligence in her silence than many people carry in a lifetime of speeches. She did what women in families often do without being thanked properly. She noticed who was hurting before they said so, who was drifting before they disappeared, who needed food, rest, correction, tenderness, or distance. I loved both of them, but I learned very early that love did not automatically create safety. A house can be loving and still be full of rules no one says out loud. In our house, the rules were simple. Boys did not linger around softness. Boys did not take too much interest in appearance unless it was athletic, polished, or useful. Boys did not cry easily, and if they did, there had better be blood, death, or genuine disaster involved. Boys especially did not stand in front of a mirror feeling relieved by the idea of becoming someone the world would call feminine. Since I did not know how to explain any of what I felt, I focused on hiding the evidence from myself as much as from anyone else. The first signs were small enough to be dismissed. I liked fabrics that moved. I liked colors that seemed to have emotional temperature. I felt jealous in ways I could not confess, not of girls as people exactly, but of the permission they seemed to have to explore expression without being punished by the same kind of suspicion. When I was alone, I touched the hem of things hanging to dry. I watched my mother putting on makeup with a fascination that had nothing to do with beauty standards and everything to do with transformation through care. She never painted herself into someone else. She just seemed to gather herself. That difference mattered to me before I had words for it. Even then I sensed that makeup, clothing, and manner were not lies by definition. Sometimes they were ways of telling the truth in a language the body understood before the mind did. I also learned guilt before I learned clarity. Curiosity turned into experimentation in the secretive, clumsy way it often does for children. I waited until the house was empty or busy enough for me to disappear. I touched what I should not touch. I put on a cardigan once and nearly panicked because the feeling that rose in me was not shame first, but relief. Relief can be terrifying when you think you are only supposed to feel it in approved places. I remember standing in front of the mirror wearing something that did not belong to me, not because I was trying to mock anyone or pretend to be part of a joke, but because for one trembling minute the static in my head got quieter. I looked awkward. I looked like a child in borrowed clothing because that is what I was. But I also looked strangely present. I took everything off so fast afterward that I almost tore a seam, and then I sat on the floor with my heart racing, not because I had done something dangerous in the usual sense, but because I had discovered that my inner life was not going to obey the script laid out for me. That kind of discovery changes the atmosphere of your whole childhood. Every normal day becomes a stage set over a basement full of questions. People like to talk about identity as if it arrives with a dramatic certainty, but for me confusion lasted years because it had so many layers. Was I just curious? Was this admiration? Was it envy? Was it play? Was I broken? Was I lonely? Was I inventing a problem where none existed? I did what many frightened children do and tried to outgrow myself through discipline. I threw myself into being agreeable. I learned how to lower my voice in social situations, how to laugh when other boys laughed, how to pretend indifference when conversations turned cruel. I never became convincing enough to feel secure, but I became quiet enough to survive. Inside, though, I was collecting evidence. Every time someone made a joke about femininity and a boy being pathetic, every time someone treated softness like weakness, every time I saw a woman criticized for how she looked and then mocked a second later if she made no effort at all, I absorbed another lesson about how tightly gender and dignity were being policed around me. I did not become less interested in myself. I became more afraid of the cost of being known. The moment with my mother happened when I was 14, and even now I can feel the density of the air in that bathroom, the muted afternoon light, the smell of powder and hairspray and clean towels. I had come home from school carrying the ordinary misery of adolescence, which in my case was made worse by the feeling that I was living at a bad angle to my own reflection. I had acne breaking out across my forehead. There was a school event coming up, not a dance, just one of those public gatherings where adults tell teenagers appearance does not matter and then proceed to evaluate them visually for hours. I was staring at myself in the mirror, pressing at my skin, furious at my face for reasons that had very little to do with acne. My mother came in behind me without knocking, which embarrassed me because I felt seen before anything was actually visible. She looked at my face, then at the counter, and then at me again. On the counter, because I had done something reckless and stupid, was one of her concealer sticks. I had taken it from her drawer, thinking I could figure it out myself, and all I had managed to do was smear a pale stripe over a red spot and make it look worse. I expected anger. I expected suspicion. I expected the kind of question that contains accusation before you even answer it. Instead, she sighed in that tired but not unkind way mothers do when they recognize both a mess and a child who does not know how to explain the mess. She stepped beside me, picked up the concealer, and said, "If you're going to use this, you can't just draw it on like paint. You have to blend it." She said it the way someone might say, "If you're going to chop onions, keep your fingers tucked." Practical. Neutral. She did not ask why first. She taught first. That mattered more than I can explain. She dabbed a little under my eye to show me the pressure, the angle, the patience. She explained that makeup was not about covering your whole face in panic. It was about noticing light, tone, texture, shape. It was about not fighting your own features so aggressively that you made yourself look harsher. Then she handed the concealer back to me and told me to try. My hands shook. I kept expecting the other shoe to drop, the real conversation, the demand for explanation, but instead she corrected my wrist, softened my touch, and showed me how powder sets creams so it doesn't slide. Nothing in her face suggested she thought this was funny. Nothing suggested she thought it was dirty. She treated it as a skill, and because she treated it as a skill, my shame loosened just enough for me to breathe. I do not want to romanticize that moment into instant understanding. She did not look at me and say, "I know exactly who you are." I did not burst into tears and reveal my whole interior life. It was much quieter than that, much more human. When we were done, she said, "There, that's better," and then she looked at me in the mirror for one extra second and added, "You don't have to attack yourself every time you look at your own face." That sentence entered me like a key. At 14, I heard it as a comment about skin and self-esteem. Much later, I understood it was also a lesson about identity. I had been approaching myself like an enemy for years. She had interrupted the pattern without even knowing the full shape of it. After that day, I started paying closer attention to her makeup not as an object of secret theft, but as a vocabulary. She did not invite me into some cinematic makeover montage, and I am grateful for that, because real love is often less performative than movies make it look. What happened instead was a series of small openings. She would sometimes leave products on the counter and tell me what they were for. She would complain about bad foundation shades and explain undertones. She would say a lipstick looked terrible in the store lighting but fine in daylight. She would mention, almost absent-mindedly, that eyebrow shape changes the whole face. None of this came wrapped in a speech about identity, but each practical detail carried a deeper permission. Attention to presentation was not inherently shallow, and the face could be a site of care rather than war. I began experimenting in private with less panic and more curiosity. I also began hating myself in a more informed way, which sounds absurd until you have lived it. Once you discover a method of self-expression that brings relief, every barrier between you and that relief becomes more visible. I could now make my face look softer in small ways, but I still had to remove everything before dinner. I could recognize that I felt calmer wearing certain clothes, but I still had to return them to their hangers and re-enter the role expected of me. Knowledge did not free me. It sharpened the contrast between who I was in private and who I performed in public. Adolescence became a long season of compartmentalization. I learned to keep track of time by emotional weather. There were evenings when the house was quiet and I could sit alone with a compact mirror, correcting and recorrecting a line until my breathing slowed. There were mornings when I woke up with a sense of dread so physical it felt like an illness, because the day required me to inhabit a version of masculinity that fit like wet wool. At school, I was not a spectacle, just uneasy. People sensed it anyway. Children and teenagers are often terrible detectives of motive, but excellent detectors of difference. I was not bullied constantly, which would have been easier to identify. What I got instead was the low-grade social pressure that can warp a person more slowly. The jokes when I spoke too carefully, the side glances when I moved in a way that seemed too measured, the sudden self-consciousness I felt any time a conversation about gender turned casual and cruel. I learned to monitor my hands, my posture, my laughter, even the amount of interest on my face when girls talked about clothes or makeup. There is a fatigue that comes from performing a role badly and being terrified that other people will notice the effort. That fatigue settled into me so deeply that I mistook it for personality. The internet complicated everything, as it does for so many of us. On one hand, it gave me language I had never heard in real life. I found stories from people who cross-dressed, from people who identified as transgender, from people who did not fit cleanly into any category but were trying with honesty to understand themselves. Some of those stories were life-saving. They told me that secrecy, confusion, and fear were not unique. They helped me distinguish between shame imposed from outside and discomfort that came from being misaligned with myself. On the other hand, the internet also fed my fear because it was full of extremes. It offered sensational versions of transformation, cruel mockery, pornography pretending to explain identity, strangers arguing about lives they had never lived, and simplistic narratives in every direction. I worried I was inventing a self out of fragments stolen from other people's words. I worried I was selfish. I worried I was ridiculous. I worried that if I ever spoke honestly, people would decide I had been lying to them all along. Nobody tells you how much moral panic can attach itself to the simple act of trying to describe your inner life. I was not asking permission to harm anyone. I was not asking for applause. I was trying to figure out why I felt more real when I allowed certain parts of myself to breathe, and even that seemed, in my environment, like a suspicious ambition. I also made mistakes, and those mistakes matter to this story, because self-discovery does not make someone innocent. There were times I crossed boundaries in secrecy because I was too afraid to ask for space openly. I borrowed my mother's things without permission. I wore them carefully, returned them neatly, and told myself that because I did no visible damage, no real harm had been done. That was not true. Privacy matters. Trust matters. Fear can explain behavior without excusing it. One day, I snapped the clasp on a necklace. Another time, I stained the inside collar of a blouse with makeup I had not fully removed. My mother noticed, of course. Mothers notice changes in fabric tension and drawer alignment with the kind of perception armies would envy. She did not confront me immediately. She waited, which was somehow worse, because it gave me time to feel the full ugliness of hiding behind her patience. When she finally spoke to me, I was 16. She came into my room holding the blouse and the necklace. She closed the door behind her. My whole body went cold. She sat on the edge of my bed and asked, very quietly, "Do you want to tell me what's going on, or do you want me to guess badly?" I think that was the first time anyone had asked me a serious question without placing a threat inside it. I cried so fast it was humiliating. Not dramatic sobbing, just the collapse that comes when a structure held up by secrecy finally gives way. I told her some of it, not all of it. I said I wore her things sometimes. I said I didn't know why exactly. I said it made me feel calmer and more like myself, and then immediately made me feel ashamed. I said I was sorry about the blouse. I said I knew it was wrong to take things without asking. She listened in a still, concentrated way that made me feel both safe and unbearable. Then she said something I have repeated to myself many times over the years. Secrecy will teach you bad habits if fear is the only place you're allowed to live. She was not excusing me. She was identifying the mechanism. She told me that if I ever used her things again without asking, the answer would be no, because the issue was not makeup or clothing by themselves, it was trust. She said if I needed to talk to her, really talk, she would try to listen, but she was not going to pretend not to notice broken boundaries just because I was hurting. That was one of the most loving things anyone has ever done for me. She did not choose between compassion and accountability. She held both. It taught me that becoming myself would not absolve me from being responsible for how I treated other people. In later years, when I saw identity discussed as if pain automatically made every action justified, I thought back to that moment. My mother understood before I did that if I wanted a life built on truth, I could not build it through quiet violations and then call those violations harmless because I was confused. So I apologized properly. I replaced what I could. I stopped taking her things. And after a while, with awkwardness on both sides, she helped me buy a few inexpensive items of my own under the pretense of theater supplies and skincare. She did not make speeches in the shopping aisle. She just asked whether the shade matched my skin and whether the sweater fit at the shoulder. Those errands felt more intimate than any confession I had ever made. I wish I could say acceptance followed naturally from there, but reality was harder. My mother's quiet kindness did not erase the rest of the world. It did not erase my father's assumptions, the social environment I lived in, or the uncertainty inside me about what any of this meant. Was I a boy who found comfort in femininity? Was I someone using crossdressing as a private method of emotional regulation? Was I a girl buried under so much fear that I could only approach myself indirectly? The truth for a long time was that I did not know. I needed years to separate the forms of expression from the identity underneath. That is another thing I wish more people understood. Clothing and makeup can be important, revealing, and emotionally significant without functioning as instant proof of a final answer. For me, crossdressing was not a joke or a thrill. It was the first practical route toward a self I did not yet know how to name. It was not the destination, but it was not trivial either. It was a bridge I crossed many times before I understood where it led. At 17, I started having periods of depression serious enough that I could no longer explain them away as normal teenage moodiness. They were not constant, which made them harder to identify. I could laugh, do homework, have conversations, even perform competence, and still be carrying a dense private hopelessness that made every future feel counterfeit. There were days when I looked at adulthood and saw only endurance. I worried that I would either disappear into a life that never fit me or ruin my relationships trying to escape it too late. I did not think of myself as brave. I thought of myself as delayed. Everyone else seemed to be stepping into personhood while I was still negotiating basic terms with the mirror. My mother urged me, gently but firmly, to talk to a counselor at school. I resisted because I thought therapy was for people whose pain could be explained in cleaner sentences than mine. Eventually, I went because not going required more energy than I had left. The school counselor was kind but limited. She was good at helping me name anxiety and perfectionism, less good at understanding gender beyond broad categories. Still, even imperfect help can matter. She gave me one useful idea early on. Confusion is not dishonesty. You are allowed to be in process. That sentence relieved me because I had been treating uncertainty as evidence of moral failure. If I couldn't declare exactly who I was, I assumed I had no right to discuss any of it at all. The counselor also encouraged me to build a life wider than my private struggle. She asked what else mattered to me. At first I resented the question because it felt like dilution. Later I understood she was trying to keep me from collapsing my whole existence into one unresolved issue. So I read more. I wrote privately. I got better at school. I learned that mental health improves not only when problems are solved, but when life becomes structurally more livable. Sleep, routine, fewer secrets, at least one safe person, work that engages the mind, and some practice in speaking truth before the pressure becomes unbearable. College gave me distance, which is not the same as freedom, but can be a beginning. Moving away from home meant I could experiment more openly in private, but it also meant I lost the daily quiet support of my mother's presence. Distance revealed how much of my stability had depended on being near someone who treated me as a human problem rather than a social threat. I tried, during my first year away, to reinvent myself as simply a more eccentric version of a man. I thought maybe if I loosened the rules enough, the crisis would pass. I grew my hair longer. I let myself care a little more about presentation. I bought clothes that hovered near androgyny without crossing any visible line. Some of that helped. Some of it felt like compromise disguised as maturity. I made friends who were more open-minded than the people I had grown up around, and for the first time I heard conversations about gender that were neither mocking nor simplistic. Even then I stayed careful. I shared fragments, never the whole picture. I told people I liked experimenting with style. I told them I felt constrained by gender norms. I did not tell them that certain nights, after taking off a carefully chosen outfit, I felt grief so strong it seemed unreasonable because the person in the mirror after removal looked like a role reasserting itself. Around that time my mother and I developed a strange, tender long-distance honesty. She would send me care packages with socks, snacks, and sometimes a skin product wrapped in tissue as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. No note explaining it, no comment, just inclusion. During phone calls, she never forced the subject, but she asked real questions. Are you sleeping? Are you eating? Are you talking to anyone honestly? The order of those questions mattered. She understood that the body and the truth are connected. If one falls apart, the other usually follows. One weekend when I came home, she showed me how to shape my eyebrows in a way that would still pass without comment if I got scared and wanted to retreat. That memory still breaks me a little because I can see now how carefully she was balancing support with respect for my pace. She was not trying to push me toward any identity. She was making room for me to discover one without total isolation. My father remained the silent weather system over everything. He was not a cartoon villain, and it would be emotionally easier if he had been. Instead, he was a decent man in many ordinary ways, and a man whose imagination had been starved by the culture that formed him. He could repair almost anything mechanical. He showed up when practical help was needed. He loved me in the language he knew, which was provision, correction, and advice on durability. But the softer, stranger, more vulnerable truths of a person terrified him because he had spent his own life hiding from them. When I visited home, I often felt my body tighten the minute I heard his truck in the driveway. There are people you love whose presence forces you back into old grammar before you can stop yourself. With him I lowered my voice half a note, shortened my gestures, edited every sentence in real time. It exhausted me, and the exhaustion filled me with resentment, and the resentment filled me with guilt because I knew he was not trying each day to ruin me. He simply believed the only safe life was one built inside familiar categories. To him, deviation looked like danger. To me, conformity felt like suffocation. Both of us thought we were protecting something important. That is how families become battlegrounds without anyone firing the first shot. My first serious romantic relationship began when I was 21, and this is one of the hardest parts of my life to tell honestly, because I am not proud of how long I waited to speak clearly. She was thoughtful, funny, and emotionally perceptive enough to notice the edges of what I had long before I admitted it. At first I believed I could build a life with her while keeping my gender questions private because I still thought private meant contained. That was unfair to both of us. Secrecy leaks. It turns tenderness into guesswork. She sensed my dissociation, my mood swings, the way intimacy sometimes made me sad instead of comforted, not because I did not care for her, but because being fully seen by someone while concealing something fundamental produced its own grief. Eventually, she asked me, in the kindest voice possible, whether there was something about myself I thought she could not handle. I told her enough to explain the crossdressing, enough to explain that it was serious and long-standing and not sexual, enough to explain that I did not fully know whether it pointed to something deeper. She listened better than I deserved. Then she said a sentence that stays with me because of how fair it was. I can make room for uncertainty, but I can't build a future around silence. That relationship did not end because she rejected me as a person. It ended because I was still too fragmented to offer someone else a stable truth. Losing her hurt, and I had to resist the temptation to rewrite the pain into a story where identity made me blameless. It did not. The pain came from timing, fear, and my unwillingness to risk honest conversation early enough. One of the most important moral lessons of my adulthood has been this. Self-discovery is deeply important, but it does not erase the responsibilities we owe to people who trust us. If you are confused, say you are confused. If you are questioning, say you are questioning. You do not need final certainty to owe someone honesty. I learned that too late in that relationship, and the consequence was real. 4 months after we broke up, I treated myself like evidence in a trial. I replayed conversations, judged my motives, wondered whether I had confused everyone around me, because I was confused myself. Depression came back hard. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just heavy, repetitive, function-eroding sadness. I went back to therapy because I finally understood that waiting for a perfect private revelation before seeking help was another form of avoidance. My therapist in my 20s was the first professional who helped me disentangle identity from panic. She did not tell me who I was. She helped me build conditions under which I could hear myself more clearly. We talked about childhood, shame, compulsive self-monitoring, dissociation, and the way I treated every feminine impulse as both precious and prosecutable. She asked me what I felt in the moments I dressed or used makeup privately. I said relief, grief, gentleness, rightness, fear, and then shame for feeling right. She asked what I felt when I had to undo it. I said loss. She asked whether I ever felt similarly relieved expressing masculinity. I said sometimes I felt competent, sometimes invisible, sometimes armored, but rarely relieved. She pointed out that relief is information. Not the only information, but important information. Over time, I stopped asking whether I was allowed to feel what I felt and started asking what the pattern of my actual lived experience suggested. The pattern was not loud, but it was consistent. The more honestly I allowed myself to inhabit femininity, the more coherent I became. The more rigidly I forced myself back into a male role for the sake of appearing normal, the more fragmented and despairing I felt. This did not mean transition became an immediate, obvious next step. I wrestled with that decision for years because I respected its seriousness. I knew transition was not a costume change and not a shortcut to happiness. I knew it had social, medical, legal, professional, and relational consequences. I had seen enough oversimplification online to distrust both the people who described transition as instant salvation and the people who described it as pathology by definition. I wanted to be responsible. I wanted to be honest about uncertainty without using uncertainty as an excuse to remain frozen forever. So I moved carefully. I came out to a few trusted friends. I allowed myself to present more consistently in private and then in limited public settings. I kept notes on my emotional state. That sounds clinical, but it helped because when you have been gaslighting yourself for years, records matter. I could see on paper that on days when I lived closer to my internal sense of self, my anxiety decreased, my attention improved, and my self-hatred softened. On days when I forced myself backward out of fear, I became brittle, irritable, and numb. My life was giving me data, and the data were not abstract. Telling my mother more fully was, in one sense, anticlimactic because on some level she had known the story was larger than makeup for years. We sat at her kitchen table, both older and more tired than we had been when this started, and I told her I thought I might not simply be a man who needed feminine expression. I told her I thought I might be a woman who had spent most of her life approaching herself sideways because a direct path felt impossible. I expected tears or confusion, or at least surprise strong enough to fracture the conversation. Instead, she was very still for a long moment and then asked whether I had support, whether I was safe, and whether I had been carrying this alone too much again. Then she cried a little, not because she was disappointed, but because she said she wished I had not spent so many years thinking I needed to make myself smaller to deserve love. I cried too, because even with all her previous kindness, I had still been afraid. Fear can survive inside love for a long time if the world outside keeps feeding it. My father was harder. There is no graceful way to compress decades of expectation into one conversation and emerge untouched. I told him later, after too much postponement and too many rehearsals, because I knew that if I waited for a perfect moment, I would never speak. He listened with a face so blank I could not tell whether he was furious, confused, or simply overwhelmed. He asked whether this meant I had been pretending all my life. I said no, it meant I had been trying to survive, without words. He asked whether someone had influenced me. I said people had helped me understand language, but nobody had created the feelings. He asked whether I was sure. I said I was sure enough to know that continuing exactly as I had been was harming me. That answer angered him, because it did not provide the certainty he wanted while still demanding that he take the issue seriously. For a while our relationship became a thin, formal thing. He did not yell. He withdrew. There are silences colder than shouting. Those months were brutal because they revived every old fear at once. I had done the responsible thing by telling the truth, and the truth had still cost me something precious. I want to say this carefully because it matters to anyone listening who imagines acceptance stories always resolve cleanly. Sometimes the people who love you need time, and sometimes the time they need hurts you. Both things can be true. You are not obligated to endure cruelty indefinitely in the name of patience, but neither does every painful response mean a relationship is permanently impossible. My father and I changed slowly because slow change was the only kind he knew. At first he avoided pronouns entirely. Then he asked practical questions because practicality was his safest route into emotional reality. Had I talked to doctors? What did transition actually involve? Was I being pressured by anyone? Was I able to work? Was I still paying my bills? Underneath those questions was a fear he could not articulate, that I was stepping into a life of instability, humiliation, or danger, and that he would lose the child he thought he knew. It took me years to understand that some of his rigidity was grief mixed with ignorance, not just rejection. That understanding did not erase my pain, but it helped me respond without flattening him into a villain. Human beings are often worst at loving each other right where fear and imagination meet. When I finally began medical transition, it felt less like leaping into a new life than ceasing to drag an old one behind me. Even then, the emotional experience was complex. I did not wake up one day transformed into certainty. I woke up into a series of adjustments, each one clarifying and humbling. Some changes brought joy so quiet I almost mistrusted it, like the first time I caught my reflection in a shop window and did not feel immediate alienation, or the first time a simple daily routine of skincare and makeup no longer felt like a secret ritual, but like ordinary self-maintenance. Some changes brought grief because transition did not give me a new adolescence. It forced me to mourn the old one I had spent in concealment. There were days when I felt newly alive and days when I was furious at how long fear had delayed my life. There were legal forms, awkward workplace disclosures, expenses I had not fully anticipated, medical appointments that made my body feel like a bureaucratic project, and social recalibrations that were exhausting in their own way. Reality remained reality. Transition did not exempt me from adulthood. What it did was make adulthood more inhabitable. The social side was unpredictable. Some people I barely knew adapted more gracefully than relatives. Some friends stepped up with a naturalness that made me realize they had been waiting for me to stop apologizing for existing. Others performed acceptance while quietly keeping me at emotional arm's length. A few disappeared. That hurt, but not all loss is catastrophe. Sometimes a relationship ends because it depended on your silence. What surprised me most was how much better my mind functioned when so much energy no longer had to be spent on concealment. My concentration improved. My humor returned. I became more reliable, not less, because honesty reduced the internal noise that had once consumed so much attention. This is something I wish more people understood about mental health and identity. Living truthfully is not self-indulgence when the alternative is chronic fragmentation. It can make a person more responsible, more present, and more capable of contributing to the lives of others. My mother remained, throughout all of this, steady in a way I still struggle to describe without crying. She did not become flawless. There were awkward moments, old habits, pronoun slips, fearful questions about safety, and occasional comments that revealed generational limits. But beneath all of it was a principle she never abandoned. I was her child, and reality was something to meet, not to deny. One afternoon after I had been living openly for a while, she asked if I wanted help updating my makeup bag because, in her words, half the stuff I'd cobbled together over the years was either the wrong shade or probably expired. We spread everything out on the kitchen table like a chemistry project. She held up brushes and laughed at how bad some of them were. She showed me again, just as she had when I was 14, how blending changes everything. Not because the goal is perfection, but because harsh lines are usually the result of rushing in fear. We talked as we worked, about completely ordinary things, and also about the life we had survived to reach that table. It struck me then that her original lesson had never only been about makeup. It had been about gentleness, patience, and refusing to assault the face in the mirror because panic wanted quick results. That lesson had become a philosophy for my whole life. There were still consequences, of course. Family gatherings became negotiations. Some relatives became performatively polite while asking my mother private questions they should have asked me directly, or not at all. A few acted as if my transition were a topic for intellectual debate rather than a lived reality, with emotional stakes. I had to learn boundaries. I had to learn that educating others can be worthwhile, but it is not a debt I owe, at every moment, and at any cost to my nervous system. I also had to learn humility in the other direction. Not every awkward question was an attack. Some people were trying badly to understand because they had never been close to anyone like me before. Discernment became essential. So did self-respect. I stopped trying to win every conversation. I started focusing on who was actually willing to relate in good faith. Emotional resilience, I learned, is not endless tolerance. It is the ability to protect your dignity without hardening into contempt. Work became one of the clearest measures of my integration. Before living openly, I had treated professionalism like camouflage. I believed that if I was competent enough, careful enough, useful enough, then maybe the rest of me could remain unexamined. After transition, I had to rebuild my relationship to work on more honest terms. That was frightening. I worried constantly about being seen first as a gender issue, and only second as a person with actual skills. There were moments that confirmed those fears, moments when curiosity about my identity overshadowed attention to my competence, moments when people praised my bravery in ways that felt suspiciously close to reducing my entire life to a narrative arc they found emotionally convenient. But there were also quieter victories. I became a better colleague because I was less dissociated. I handled conflict more directly. I wasted less energy managing impressions. I could sit in meetings and think about the work itself instead of performing masculinity badly at the edge of every thought. Integration is not glamorous, but it is deeply practical. It changes how you show up for ordinary obligations, and ordinary obligations are what most of a life is made of. As the years passed, I became more interested in the ethical and social dimensions of my story, not just the personal ones. I had spent so long focused on survival that I had not fully considered what my life might teach me about other people. Crossdressing had once been, for me, a private bridge toward identity. Transition had become a way of living honestly. But both experiences also educated me about the artificial violence of many social norms. I saw how often people confuse familiarity with morality. I saw how quickly appearance gets treated as character evidence. I saw how much damage is done when entire groups of people are reduced to symbols in other people's political or cultural anxieties. I also saw how fear operates across the board. Parents fear losing children they do not yet know how to understand. Partners fear being misled or abandoned. Gender nonconforming people fear ridicule, violence, economic precarity, or loneliness. Communities fear change because change exposes the limitations of the stories they use to organize themselves. Compassion does not require pretending these fears are equal in effect, but it does require recognizing that shame spreads in systems, not just individuals. The more I reflected, the more I wanted to tell my story in a way that increased understanding rather than simply announcing suffering. That is why I have always resisted turning my life into spectacle. There were periods when I was tempted. Pain can make attention feel like justice. If people had ignored or misunderstood me for years, wasn't I owed a dramatic unveiling, a narrative in which everyone finally recognized what they had missed? But that hunger, if fed carelessly, can make a person start performing their own life instead of living it. So I tried, imperfectly, to remain grounded. I did not want my story used as evidence that all journeys are identical. They are not. I did not want crossdressing flattened into transition because for some people it is not that. I did not want transition framed as fashionable rebellion because it is too serious for that and too costly. I did not want femininity treated as costume, nor masculinity treated as enemy essence. I wanted to say something more ordinary and more difficult. Sometimes a human being spends years assembling the courage to stop fighting their own reflection, and when they do, the result is not fantasy, but responsibility. Bills still need to be paid. Apologies still need to be made. Relationships still need honesty. Mental health still requires maintenance. But life becomes possible in a different register when you are no longer at war with yourself from dawn to sleep. If I could speak to my younger self directly now, I would not tell that child that everything works out beautifully because that would not be true and children know when adults are lying in motivational language. I would tell that child that confusion can last a long time without invalidating the truth of what is felt. I would say that secrecy can keep you alive for a while, but it also trains you into habits that will eventually wound you and others if you do not outgrow them. I would say that femininity is not weakness, that makeup is not fraud, that clothing can be language, and that none of these things determine moral worth. I would say that if you are hurting, you need at least one person and one place where the performance can stop. I would say that the goal is not to become uncriticizable, because no such life exists. The goal is to become honest enough that criticism does not separate you from yourself. I would also say something I learned slowly from my mother. Gentleness is not the opposite of seriousness. Some of the most serious acts of love are gentle ones. My relationship with my father changed most visibly much later, after the heat of disclosure had cooled into the long work of reality. I visited my parents one winter afternoon years after I had begun living openly. My father was in the garage, repairing something ordinary, which was where he always went when emotions exceeded language. I stood there talking with him about tools and weather, and one small, mechanical problem after another. Then, in the middle of handing me a wrench, he used my name, the right one, without ceremony. He did not pause afterward. He did not look at me to see whether I had noticed. It was as if he had finally allowed reality to become practical enough to use. I nearly cried in that garage, surrounded by cold air and motor oil, because some forms of acceptance arrive not as speeches, but as incorporation. He was still himself, reserved, stubborn, limited in some ways, but he had made room. People do not always change in the language we wish they would. Sometimes they change in the grammar available to them, and we learn to hear the love inside it. I've been asked whether my mother's makeup lessons made me who I am, and the answer is no, not in the simplistic sense. She did not invent my identity with a concealer stick and a powder brush. What she changed was the emotional environment in which I discovered myself. She interrupted shame with instruction. She interrupted panic with patience. She showed me that self-presentation could be approached as care rather than deceit. She insisted on boundaries where I had crossed them, which taught me that being in pain does not excuse violating trust. She made space without trying to dictate the conclusion. In a world that often reacts to gender variance with either mockery or alarm, that kind of grounded support can alter the whole trajectory of a life. Not because it answers every question, but because it keeps the person asking those questions from being crushed under them. There is also something else I have come to understand about crossdressing, at least in my own life. For years, I was afraid the word itself would cause people to stop listening. They would either sexualize it, trivialize it, or assume it existed only as entertainment, deception, or pathology. For me, it was none of those things. It was, in the beginning, the only available path to relief from a role I could not fully name as wrong yet. It gave me a way to notice what happened emotionally when I aligned expression with inner sense. It revealed not only what I wanted to look like, but how I wanted to move through the world, with more honesty, more softness, more coherence. That does not mean everyone who crossdresses is discovering they are transgender, and it is important not to erase the diversity of people's experiences. But it does mean that for some of us, what begins as hidden experimentation is actually the first fragile draft of a more truthful life. If the world responded to that possibility with less ridicule and more curiosity, I think far fewer people would spend years mistaking themselves for a problem to be solved. By my 30s, the word that mattered most to me was not transition, but integration. Transition describes movement, and movement is important, but integration describes what I had wanted all along without knowing it. I did not just want permission to dress differently, or use a different name, or alter my body. I wanted my inner life, outer life, values, relationships, and responsibilities to stop contradicting each other so violently. I wanted to be someone who could love others without resentment born of self-erasure. I wanted to be dependable without feeling invisible. I wanted to look in the mirror and feel recognition rather than negotiation. Integration also meant accepting complexity. I did not become a simpler person. I became a more honest one. I still carried traces of old shame. I still had days when fear returned in familiar forms. I still had to care for my mental health actively. But the baseline of my life changed from suppression to participation. I was no longer watching myself from a distance, waiting for the real life to begin once all uncertainty disappeared. I was in it. If there is any educational value in my story, I hope it lies here. Identity exploration is not a moral failure. It is not selfish to ask who you are if the answer determines whether your life feels inhabitable. At the same time, self-exploration does not release you from responsibility. You still owe people honesty where honesty is due. You still owe respect for other people's boundaries. You still need help, structure, and patience if your mental health is suffering. No one is served by reducing complicated lives to slogans. Empathy matters because most people are carrying histories you cannot see. Social norms matter because they shape the possibilities people can imagine for themselves, often long before those people have language to resist them. Emotional resilience matters because truth alone does not prevent pain. It helps you move through pain without dissolving into it. Self-respect matters because if you build your whole life around making others comfortable with your silence, you may wake up years later praised for a version of you that never really got to live. I still think often about that first afternoon in the bathroom with my mother, the concealer stick on the counter, the tiny mercy of being taught before being judged. Everything that came later was more complicated than that moment. There were years of confusion, fear, depression, therapy, lost relationships, difficult disclosures, transition, compromise, repair, and slow acceptance. But the emotional logic of my life changed there. Before that day, every feeling that pointed me toward femininity arrived wrapped in alarm. After that day, at least one person had shown me that curiosity could coexist with dignity. That self-presentation could be learned. That the face in the mirror did not have to be attacked. Once you have been given even a small experience of gentleness at the site of your deepest shame, you can spend years returning to it like a map. I did. So when people ask me what changed my life forever, I do not say makeup in the shallow sense, and I do not say transition as if it were a single dramatic event. I say my life changed when someone I loved responded to my confusion with seriousness instead of mockery, with boundaries instead of panic, and with practical care instead of denial. My life changed when I slowly stopped confusing performance with goodness. My life changed when I learned that truth is not always loud at first. Sometimes it begins as relief, then becomes grief, then courage, then responsibility, then an ordinary Tuesday in a life that finally feels like your own. If my story offers anything to anyone listening, I hope it is not a demand to copy my path. I hope it is a reminder to meet yourself and others with more patience than fear, more honesty than performance, and more humility than certainty. Some people need room to discover that what they thought was a private oddity is actually a clue to a fuller self. Some parents need to know that listening carefully can matter more than having the perfect vocabulary. Some partners need to hear that uncertainty should be spoken before it hardens into silence. Some people struggling in secret need to know that there is nothing noble about hating yourself into respectability. And some of us, after years of moving through the world in fragments, need to hear that integration is possible, not as fantasy, but as work, as practice, as daily life built a little more truthfully than the day before. I am not grateful for every part of the pain. I do not think suffering automatically ennobles people, and I would never recommend confusion as a path to wisdom. But I am grateful for what honesty made possible once I finally stopped treating my own reflection like a witness for the prosecution. I am grateful for therapy, for friends who stayed, for those I hurt who told me the truth, for the woman I once loved who taught me that silence is not kindness, for the professionals who treated my life as real rather than rhetorical, for the version of me who kept going when certainty was still far away, and most of all for my mother, who changed my life not by solving me, but by showing me, with a concealer stick and a patient hand, that care can reveal what fear keeps trying to erase. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.